Okay, the first or most current war that we're going to start with is the war in Afghanistan. And we talked about a little bit before. We're at the tail end of the war in Afghanistan. We're supposed to be moving most of our troops out ASAP, and as a matter of fact, we're actually starting currently to move some of our troops out. We've reduced the numbers from the high point earlier, but we still have a pretty significant role in Afghanistan. So we're going to kind of run through sort of the background of the war in Afghanistan, what some of the early conflicts were. Obviously, this has taken place over the last 13 or so years, so we're not going to cover every battle. We're not going to cover everything. We're going to kind of cover the beginning and then sort of like what's been going on the last 8 or so years. Look at the cost, look at the impact, and then we'll talk a little bit about what is left. So you should already have this in your notes or in your graphic organizer, but October 7th, 2001 to present. And as we look at this, sort of the background of Afghanistan, as we know, is September 11th. So you guys, if you look at the pictures, if you watch any of the videos, which I would encourage you to do, September 11th was one of those unexpected events. No one saw it coming. As it turns out, the government probably should have seen it coming, but you know, the old saying, hindsight's 20/20. Reality, most everyday Americans had no idea that anyone wanted to do this on this scale to our country. So basically kind of shook America, caused America to wake up. And remember, that was New York City, the Pentagon, and there's one more plane in Pennsylvania that ended up crashing. So these hijacked planes, by what nobody really knew what was going on at that point. At first they thought that it was an accident, and then as the days went on, they realized it was a terrorist attack. How could this happen? What happened? What were the results? And so let's just kind of go through who was in charge here real quick. So we have President Bush has been in office not extremely long time, not extremely popular. If you kind of remember your history a little bit, we'll talk about it a little bit later probably, but he was elected in a very close contested election. The Supreme Court had to get involved and count votes, and technically he didn't win the popular vote, and so he wasn't extremely popular at this point. But this is George W. Bush, not George H.W. Bush, which was his dad. So he's president from 2001 to 2009. So in September, he's only been in office for a few months. And his vice president was Dick Cheney. These guys are important because a lot of people don't like the decisions that they make, but these are the architects of the Afghan and Iraq war. Secretary of Defense, so this is the guy that's in charge of the military, is Donald Rumsfeld. He comes up with sort of a unique plan for the military, and that's to be lighter, faster, to use technology as an advantage, which is different than before. I mean, our traditional military is like, we're just going to roll in with bigger stuff and move slowly and you're not going to be able to stop us. He wanted lighter equipment that would move faster, that could gain ground faster, which does a very good job to conquer things, maybe not as great of a job to hold things. But he was essentially the one that planned, with the general, is essentially the one that planned the Iraq and Afghanistan war. So last person that's important to note, especially later for Iraq, is Colin Powell. He was the Secretary of State. He was a decorated war leader, 5-star general. And he makes the case for war, especially in Iraq, but you just need to know that name. He was very well respected going into that job. Actually, a lot of people thought he could have run for president and won. And his name kind of gets a little bit corrupted or dirty during this whole process between the two wars, because he tries to convince people that the intelligence we have for Iraq, which we're not talking about right now, but we'll get there later, is good intelligence when it proves it's not. So he's an important player in these first two wars that we're going to discuss. So our reaction to September 11th, and this is one of those good history topics to talk about with your parents and grandparents, people that lived through it, or even if you have siblings that are quite a bit older than you are. But most people had kind of a few sort of reactions. So if we could narrow this down into reactions: patriotism, fear, and anger. Okay, so in some ways it wasn't considered cool to be pro-American in some ways. A lot of people were kind of like, oh, well, we're America, whatever. But after September 11th, it kind of went back to the idea of we're Americans. We're proud to be Americans. So that response, people were afraid at first. They didn't know what was going on, where it was coming from. People, the airplanes really caused a lot of fear. The flight system throughout the U.S. shuts down for an extended period of time. There's no flights. No one will get on flights. People are afraid there's another attack coming, and there's rumors. People are afraid that anyone that looks like they might be, once we start to figure out that this is Islamic extremist or Al-Qaeda, anybody that looks like they may possibly sort of be from the Middle East, people are afraid of. If you see people that are dressed a certain way, you're afraid of them. For some people for a very long period of time, some people for a short period of time. But right in the wake of that, there was a lot of fear. And then anger. People were upset. Somebody needs to get this. How dare they do this to us? So some of these pictures, we have workers, firefighters. You see in the news and the media the rescue workers that work nonstop in the Pentagon, and especially at the Trade Center, trying to find bodies. And remember, all this is being just broadcast live pretty much. These guys become heroes, and both military at the Pentagon, and then fire and rescue and police officers in New York City. And you always see these pictures with flags and this patriotic feeling. Popular culture starts to reflect really quick what people are feeling. So country music, if you like country music, Toby Keith's song, there's a lot of kind of angry music that comes out of this. Music sort of reflects the attitudes of people, so we see that put into words real quickly. We also see some people respond with sort of, okay, what are we doing? What's going on? We go from September 11th to October 7th, so we don't even go a month before we're at war. And some people were kind of saying, okay, we can't go to war over this. We can't, label a certain group of people. But they were probably in the minority. Most people were ready for action, so to speak. So. And the idea of what we're doing is remembering or honoring the memory of those people that died, kind of is the theme at the beginning of the Afghanistan War. So it's like, you can't do this to us, we're going to get you back, and here we go. So Afghanistan was one of those places most people had no clue where it was on a map. A lot of people probably would have said Afghanistan, and they would have been vague that it was even a country. So in Asia, next to Russia, next to Iran, by Iraq, very isolated, mountainous, poor country. Basically, Afghanistan has a very long history of conflict. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union tried to conquer Afghanistan, and we actually armed, the CIA gave weapons to fight against the Russians to the Afghani fighters, which in that case, we actually armed Osama bin Laden and gave him weapons that they later used against us 20 some odd years later. So there's this long history of conflict and long history all the way back to Genghis Khan of foreign invaders trying to take over the country or the area. And a lot of Afghanis identify themselves as tribal and clannish, so they identify with their tribes, with their families, and the country is not necessarily the first thing. But they have this long history of people trying to take them over. So when we show up after September 11th, it's kind of just one in another list of people that are trying to take them over. There's not any oil, there's not any great wealth necessarily in Afghanistan, just a very rich, long history. When September 11th happened, a group called the Taliban was in charge of Afghanistan. The Taliban is still around, but the Taliban is an Islamic group, and they were in charge of most of Afghanistan. So you essentially had a civil war between the Islamic fighters of the Taliban and the group called the Northern Alliance, which was more secular group. Now, they were still Islamist. I mean, they were still Muslim, but they didn't believe in the strict rule of Sharia law, which is Islamic law. So in Taliban-held territory, women weren't allowed to go to school. there's just a lot of really strict traditional interpretations of Islam. And the Taliban actually sheltered Osama bin Laden and allowed al-Qaeda to grow there. And our government knew about al-Qaeda, we just didn't realize that they were going to do something there. So al-Qaeda wasn't in charge. Al-Qaeda is the name of the group that Osama bin Laden started that essentially becomes synonymous with terrorist. And their job was to fight jihad or holy war against Western enemies of Islam. So he was a very rich guy, born into a wealthy family, actually one of the most wealthy families in Saudi Arabia. And he kind of is one of a whole bunch of kids, but he goes off and to fight this holy war, and he sets up his base in Afghanistan. So after the war, after September 11th, we basically look at Afghanistan and say, okay, Taliban, you got to give us Osama bin Laden now, as in like today. And they basically say, if you prove it and that he did it, then we'll talk, because at that point, al-Qaeda didn't say they did anything wrong. They wouldn't take responsibility for September 11th. The U.S. said, no, we're not going to prove it. We have evidence. We're not going to show it to you. You give them to us now. And that goes on for a couple weeks. And then finally they're like, okay, we'll give them to you. And the U.S. is like, it's too late, and we attack. So here's where we get. In the early years, so October 7th and on, the negotiations end very, very quickly. We have Operation Enduring Freedom, which is the name for the battle or plan in Afghanistan. It's later going to change, but at the beginning it's Enduring Freedom. So we're going to get back at whoever did attack us, and we believe that was al-Qaeda at that time, and Osama bin Laden. So we're going to get them, and we're going to spread freedom around the world. So we basically do this through, at the beginning, air support, CIA, and special operations. And remember that picture I just showed you of the Northern Alliance. What we do at the beginning is that Northern group is fighting against the Taliban. So we ally with them. We go in and we try and help them fight against the people in the south of the Taliban. So we have superior technology, and basically the Taliban doesn't really stand much of a chance. They'd never fought against air power before. They didn't really know what was coming, and a lot of times their tactics weren't very good, and they didn't have the weapons. So a couple pictures here, just so you can kind of get an idea. Afghanistan, again, it's mountainous, populated, but cities aren't like what we would recognize as cities. So it's not exactly the same. If you look at news reports, you're going to see the same thing. But that's a modern city in Afghanistan. And if you look at the buildings kind of close, you notice that that's not, the same level of what we have. Now, when you get up in the mountains in the rural area, you see lots of poverty. And this may be closer to what you'd be looking at, more of a historic type of a lifestyle, where you have isolated villages, very isolated people, family groups are sort of in charge, local chieftains or local leaders rule. And then we had a lot of people with guns, because they've been fighting a civil war, so most people had guns, and it was sort of, they were already on a fighting footprint when the U.S. gets there, but not anything like what we would see today. So some of the weapons that we had, they would have maybe shoulder-mounted anti-aircraft weapons from the 80s. They would have machine guns. They would have rocket-propelled grenades. But a lot of their technology, their weapons, were things that the U.S. had given them in the 80s and 90s when they fought against the Russians. So we kind of used a lot of different stuff. So some of the big things that were very successful at the beginning of the war, AC-130 gunship. It was a transport plane that was modified and pretty much was like, had every kind of gun that you could possibly want, and they would fly around and shoot at things. So if you know anything about weapons, you know that list on there, the 105 millimeter howitzer, the 40 millimeter cannon, 25 millimeter gun, those are all big guns, and this thing would just blow up whatever was in its path, and it would just circle over a battlefield and kind of eliminate whatever was on the ground. We also used large bombs and weapons, pretty much all kinds of bombs, but including the 15,000 pound bomb, and one of those bombs is shown there. So it's called the Daisy Cutter, and we would use this to attack into the mountains, into the caves, and essentially a 15,000 pound bomb is going to do a lot of damage. So a lot of helicopters, so Apaches, Black Hawks, things of that nature. And again, the idea here is that the Taliban's completely outgunned. Special operations, CIA forces were essentially the initial part of the war. So we essentially won the war, defeated the Taliban with special operations forces, CIA forces. This particular picture is at the very beginning of the war. CIA forces were fighting with the Northern Alliance on horseback because they basically were dropped in and we didn't have any supplies. And that was to tell our planes and helicopters where to shoot. So they were basically spotting for Taliban positions. So, you know, when we think of our military having superior technology, we do, and we win because of that. So one of the key battles that the only one we're really going to focus on for a second is right at the beginning of the war, is Tora Bora, and that was where we almost caught Osama bin Laden. So Tora Bora is basically a mountain region, and our intelligence had told us that he was holed up or, you know, kind of hiding in Tora Bora, which if you can look at this picture, you see the border Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is right next door, and he was supposedly hiding in these areas. So we basically surround the area and start shooting everything, basically, more or less, and the idea is to surround him and to capture Osama bin Laden, which was really what we were after for the most part in Afghanistan. So just a quick overview of that battle. As the Al-Qaeda forces and the Taliban forces are destroyed through the rest of the country, they basically pull back to Tora Bora. And we don't know exactly how many of them are there. We do know that we think that their high-level leadership is there. So they have, in the mountains, there's more or less a network of caves, and they were well supplied, and we didn't really understand what we were fighting against. We didn't realize that they were, you know, supplied and they could go from one cave to the next. And essentially we bomb and bomb and bomb, and then when we go in, they say, okay, we'll surrender. Turns out that's more of a stalling tactic. And anyway, long story short, Osama bin Laden escapes. That was really the best chance in 2001 of catching him. In December 2001, we almost caught him, and as we know, we don't end up catching him for multiple years, and he ends up being found in Pakistan. So this is sort of like one of the last battles, and if you go by dates, this is extremely quick. We're 2 months into the war, and we've essentially collected or taken over all of Afghanistan. So this is a picture from the Tora Bora battle with U.S. and British special operations with Northern Alliance, and all the guys have their faces blurred because their identities need to be protected because of their jobs. So what we see is by the end of 2001, essentially Afghanistan is under Northern Alliance and U.S. control. So if you think about that, and we're still there, so what the heck has happened over the last 13 years? Essentially, the Taliban regroups and starts an insurgency. And if you remember those pictures with the mountains and with everything, it's almost impossible to eliminate all of them. They just blend back in, they fall back, they blend into their territory. We don't speak the language, we don't know the people. That's a very isolated country, and so we don't know who's good and who's bad. So a lot of them blend back in until we kind of, whenever the U.S. leaves, then they come back out. The other issue is a lot of them go back and forth between Afghanistan and Pakistan, so we can't catch them. As soon as we attack them, they just run into Pakistan because Pakistan doesn't have good control over the border region. It's sort of unlawful tribal region where the central government of Pakistan is not in charge. And the last thing, and probably the most important thing, is the Taliban and the fighters against the U.S. enjoy popular support, because the Afghan people remember what happened in the 80s with the Russians invading, and then they see us. Most of them see us as a foreign invader, and they don't think that we should be there. So no matter how bad they didn't like the Taliban, or no matter what they think, most of them support their own people fighting against us versus us fighting against them. So so if you skip all the way forward from 2001 it takes till 2011 before we capture Osama bin Laden, and he's killed in Pakistan. So essentially, from 2002 till now, we've been fighting an insurgency of the Taliban. We've been fighting for popular support. We've been trying to rebuild the country. The Taliban and the insurgency of the people that are fighting against us have used guerrilla tactics. So they don't fight us directly. They hide. They use roadside bombs, suicide bombs, and things like that. And we just don't have enough, never really had enough people to eliminate them totally. We'd go to one place and we'd kill them, eliminate them, they'd disappear, and then we'd go to another place, kill them and eliminate them, but they'd come back to the other place, sort of like whack-a-mole. Wherever we don't have enough troops, they come back. So the big picture for us here is that what happened is we have, from the U.S. perspective, about 20,000 wounded and 2,300 killed. And if you sort of look at this graph, you can see that from 2002 to 2013, at the beginning of the war, we don't really suffer casualties. A few, but not very much. So during the actual fighting phase, we're extremely, extremely successful. Once this fighting phase slows down and it turns into an occupation, or we're trying to rebuild their government, rebuild their country, establish democracy, all these things, then we have a problem. So if you look at the death tolls, we have just as many people killed by things like IEDs or roadside bombs or suicide bombers or things like that, and as we do anything else. So there's a couple of points on here. I mean, we see some of the milestones. It's not till 2010 that we have 1,000 people killed, but essentially when we don't leave, when we don't get out of there, the Taliban grows stronger kind of each year, and the fighting really picks up in 2008 to 2012. So you can see the deaths are kind of spread around the country, but Kandahar, Helmand province, which is on the south part of the country, is the deadliest place for Americans. That's where the Taliban enjoys most popular support. So you see branches of service, mostly Army and Marine Corps, obviously Navy and Air Force, not as many. And you can also see by age, that graph's kind of interesting. When we fight in wars, most of the people that die are young. So 18 to 25 or even 18 to 30 is the largest age group of that. So in cost in dollars, and this graph will be, or this picture will be interesting, for each soldier that we send into battle. Now this includes everything, not just this includes their training, their trip to and from Afghanistan, but for each soldier it's about $1 million. Okay, so this is how it's spent per soldier. If you divided by the number of soldiers we have how we spend our money. So operations, which is training, transporting equipment, that's the biggest expense. It's half of the cost of the war. But it's also worn out gear, training of Afghan soldiers, intelligence, construction, research, all these different things. So if you start to think about how much it costs to send someone there, what we get for a person, it's about $1 million a person. So the total cost of our obligations, if you look at what it means to fund a soldier, we have to fund them while they're there, which we said is like $1 million a person, but we also have to fund them afterwards. Okay, so we promise to pay for their health care, their social security, disability if they're wounded, and those things are going to go on and on as long as they're alive. So if you look at the cost of that, this is billions of dollars just in disability payments and this is for Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's hard to separate some of these two numbers because they're going on together. But I mean, we've spent over $6 billion just on disability spending for veterans. So that kind of overall comes into, if you were to take Iraq and Afghanistan, somewhere around $6 trillion with a T. Okay. Give or take. These are estimates because these numbers are going to go into the future, but they think that we have spent about $2 trillion so far already. And this was as of the end of 2012, so it's been more than that. But that's only a fraction of the ultimate price tag, because we're going to have to provide medical care, disability, hospital stays, all that to our veterans, which we should. We owe them that, but it's a huge cost for all these guys that have fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. So we're looking at somewhere around $4 to $6 trillion if you include medical costs for wounded, and the cost of depleting our military force, rebuilding things like airplanes, tanks, trucks, guns, all the stuff that we use, the weapon that we use. So really $6 trillion is kind of the rough total cost for that. Problem is, and we'll talk about this in class a little bit, right now, so far, all of that money has been borrowed. All the Iraq and Afghanistan money was off budget. We basically just borrowed straight for it. So if you think about that, we've added $2 trillion to our national debt just to fight those two wars, and we're still on the hook for another $2 to $4 trillion. So kind of the impact, just popularity of the war in Afghanistan. Extremely popular at first. Most people said, get them, go. Get them, go, 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 go. We need to get this over with. We have to, repay these guys or capture and kill them. The problem is it lasts 13 years, and no one thought that, including the president, the government. Is like, okay, these guys don't have the right kind of weapons. There's just these backwoods sort of, hick people out in the middle of nowhere, and it's not going to be a big deal. We'll take care of these people, which militarily we did. The problem was we never could convince the people to become democratic. We never could convince the people to change, and so we had to stay there a long time. So if you look at sort of the numbers, in 2001, 90% of people approved. Okay, so like everybody. Okay, we had a Republican president. 97% of Republicans said, yeah, let's do this. 85% of Democrats, 87% of independents. And that's September 19th through 23rd. Okay, so later, like currently, and this is from like 2012, pretty much half the country thinks that this is the wrong thing. So if you look at that, 67% of people think that it's the right thing if you're a Republican. On the second graph on the bottom, 36% if you're a Democrat. So 47% overall don't believe that the war was worth fighting. 42% don't believe that we should fight, and 11% don't believe. So kind of funny how public opinion changes from right afterwards. 90% said, yep, let's do this, and now less than half. So the war, as it's gone on, as people believe we can't win, as it's cost more, as more people have died, has become not popular. Possibly one of the most unpopular wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, in history, even more so than Vietnam in some ways. So, okay, so 2.5 million people have served in Iraq and Afghanistan. 37,000 Americans have been deployed more than 5 times. 10,000 members of the National Guard or reserve units have been deployed more than 5 times. And if you think about that, the stress that puts on a family, usually deployments are a year, so you'd be gone for a year and you come back. 400,000 service members have done 3 or more deployments. That's a huge stress on families, marriages, kids, post-traumatic stress. These wars haven't been easy to fight because the people don't necessarily want us there. We don't know who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. You see lots of things like suicide bombings and sort of terrible things. So we have a huge issue right now with our veterans and the stress that put on them, and that's one of the things we're going to look at, or you'll at least have the opportunity to look at if that's something you're interested in. But one of those stresses is resulted in this, and if you look at this graph, it's going to show you active duty suicide numbers, and if you think of soldiers who fight in a war, that know how to take care of themselves, you wouldn't think that suicide would necessarily be an issue, but because of the stresses that is put on their lives, both in what they see and what they do while deployed and what it's done to their family, you see that the number of suicides goes way up with multiple deployments. So you see, kind of like civilian rate, military rate used to be much lower. So in 2003, you had much, less chance of doing these things, but as these wars go on, you see that chart continues to go up. So we have a huge increase in suicide rate, and this is deaths per 100,000. So it's still not a huge number, but it's an alarming thing, and it shows you like how much stress we're putting on our military. Which, if you remember, these guys are all volunteer. Well, at this point, so veterans under 35. Again, going back to the stress, the number of deaths per 100,000 people, if you look at veterans, is extremely, extremely high. And a lot of this because of accidental death. A lot of the veterans come back and have trouble with alcoholism, have trouble with drugs, or have trouble with just silly, stupid behavior like driving too fast or doing stuff like they don't care about life. They just can't make sense of what they went through and what they've seen. So accidental deaths and suicides are extremely, extremely high if you look at compared to non-veterans, and that is kind of one of the things that is a big issue in today's society is how do we deal with returning veterans? How do we help them get through what they've gone through, because they served our country and now they're having all these struggles back in civilian life. So where we're at as far as the legacies, we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We're just at the end of this. Does Afghanistan become a democracy? That's what we're hoping for with elections. Does it become a stable country, or does it go back to sort of instability, civil war, a haven for terrorists, a place where drugs are being distributed or sold or trafficked through? Some of the historical issues with that country. And we've spent a lot of time, a lot of money, and we've lost a lot of people and ruined a lot of lives, both on our side and on their side, trying to, in theory, make this a better place for the people that live in Afghanistan, and we just don't know if that's going to happen at this point.